views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the hosts and guests, and not necessarily those of the staff and management of WWDB-TV.
Whether she's walking the red carpet or doing interviews, you'll find her with celebrities and all the latest news. She's here, she's there, she's everywhere, she's always on the go. So sit back, relax, and get ready, 'cause it's the Corey Taylor Talks Show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Corey Taylor Talks, live from Las Vegas, the #1 teen talk show. I am very excited about my guest today because, as a lot of you guys know, I am a total history buff, and this guy is truly just so interesting, and he has an incredible story, and he wrote this phenomenal book that really I think everyone thinks they know everything that happened in World War II. But this book really reveals such a key factor that I really don't believe hardly anybody knew about. So I am so excited to have him on. He has such a huge, amazing career, and it's really an honor to talk to him today. So I have Mr. Stan Goldman with me. So hi, Stan. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you? I got a little bit of a remnant of a cold from last week, so sorry if I sound the slightest bit raspy, but it's a heck of a lot better than it was 2 days ago.
Oh, no, you're fine. You sound great, but are you feeling better, at least?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, cool.
I'm feeling fine.
Good. Glad to hear. So why don't we get right into it? Like I said in the intro, I talked a little bit about your book, but you also have this incredible career. I mean, you've worked with so many networks, and I mean, really, you're such a fascinating guy who apparently is brilliant as well. So why don't you tell people a little bit about your career, and then we'll get into everything in your book as well.
Yep. Well, without agreeing with that opinion that I'm a brilliant guy.
You are.
I started out as a public defender in downtown L.A. as soon as I got out of law school, and I did that for 8 years. As I like to say, defending murderers for a living, and but those 8 years, I got myself a job at night teaching, and in that 8th year, they wanted me to come on full time, so I accepted, and I came on full time here at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, where I've been teaching ever since, and but I took about a dozen years in the middle there, and I had I did news. I wrote for the New York Daily News for a couple of years and published a bunch of stories there. And then I did some work for CNBC, and then I went to work for the Fox News Channel. And I had moonlighted over the years for lots of different networks. I like to say I'm the only person who will ever live who qualifies for a pension check from both the LA County Public Defender and the Fox News Channel.
That's true.
It's an odd combination.
Right, absolutely, but that's very cool. And how did you even get involved with the networks and writing and everything and covering all these cases? Because I know you've covered a lot of very famous ones, such as Scott Peterson, O.J. Simpson, Michael Jackson, the Clinton impeachment. I mean, so many that you've covered. How did you get involved with that career choice from doing law school and being a lawyer and also doing this as well? How did you get involved with that?
I actually don't know. You'll think I'm either lying or suffering from amnesia, but I honestly don't know how I got my start. I was sitting around my office at Loyola one day. I'd already become a professor and had been here a few years, and luckily had tenure, so it's tough to fire you, as probably some of your listeners know. And I was sitting here, and I got a call from the New York Daily News somehow. And I never found out who. They were looking for somebody to write about law issues in the news, and somehow they'd gotten referred to me. I never knew whether it was somebody who'd heard me lecture, or I never knew what it was, but they called and asked. And at first they said, well, we'd like you to do a couple of columns for us, for a couple of weeks. And I did that, and after the first few columns came out, they said, hey, how would you like to do this like full-time regularly, So I did that for a while, and that led me to people would read my stories, my columns, and they'd get me on the news the way you see reporters on the news talking about the stories they've written, and that got me a job at CNBC for a little while. I hosted a show at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 6 o'clock West Coast time on Saturday night for a while, and then the Fox News Channel contacted me out of the blue and said, look, we're looking for an objective, legal reporter, correspondent. Are you interested in coming on board? Luckily my job didn't involve any politics. I mean, in the sense that I didn't have to be right wing or left wing or anything about it. I was just covering trials, and that's for the most part where I covered most of my trials. Not all. I'd covered some before, but I sat in on O.J. Simpson, and I sat in on the Scott Peterson trial for months, and Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. I was in Colorado for that, in Denver, and everything. You name it. I was around the country. Marv Albert, the guy who was charged once with a crime, and he was tried in Maryland. I sat in on that, and I can't even go through the list of trials I did, because I did that for about a decade.
No, I always think it's so cool. I always wanted to be a lawyer, but that is, trust me, never going to happen. I think that's so cool. And then for you to be able to...
Oh, never say never.
Oh, it's not going to happen. But to sit on all those very high-profile trials as well and cover... I mean, that's a really cool thing, I'm sure. I tell you something that was only slightly
cooler. It was when I was covering the Scott Peterson famous terrible murder trial. Took place up north, the guy who murdered his pregnant wife. The lead defense attorney and the lead prosecutor, the guys arguing every day in court against each other, the leads in the cases, had both been students of mine.
Oh, wow.
And they'd been law students of mine when they were in law school, and so there I was watching two students battling it out while I was covering it as a reporter.
Wow, that's crazy. So, I mean, you're kind of the whole foundation of it then. They got their career from you, so that's pretty cool.
And I'm not certain they both agree with that. One of them just finished representing Colin Kaepernick, so I suspect he thinks it's well-deserved on his part without anything to do with me.
Well, they wouldn't be there without you. I believe that. So, I mean, you taught them, so I mean that's a really big thing, and I mean I think that kind of shows you as well. If you were the teacher for these very high-profile lawyers, I mean you taught them. So can you imagine how you are? I mean that's really cool. That's amazing.
It all depends on whether they learned anything.
Well, they must have. So let's talk about now too. So you have this amazing career, and what's even cooler, what's more fascinating actually, is your mother. She has this incredibly powerful story, and I don't even know where to begin with it. Why don't you tell people a little bit about her story, and then how you actually wrote this phenomenal book that has just rave reviews?
Well, I don't want to start people out by depressing everybody. It's actually intended, the book, and I actually intended it for people around the age of my students, like 22 to 26. That's kind of the age I kind of wrote the book for. People who didn't know about the what went on during World War II and the Holocaust might think they know a little about it, but don't. And also the effect, that a parent who suffered from such horrific PTSD, can have on their kids. They may realize it, they may not realize it, but it really gets passed on from generation to generation, and there's a lot of psychosis and effect that goes with both sides of that, the parent and the child. And but my mother, I just start out by saying, look, my mother survived the worst of what we call the Holocaust. She survived Auschwitz. She survived another death camp. She survived slave labor, working in a German factory, forced to work in a German factory in the heart of the Allied bombing raids of Berlin in the last 9 months of the war, 10 months of the war. That's when the really most intensive bombing in the history of the world was taking place, as they were bombing, certainly of the war, they were bombing Berlin, the Allies, and my mother was in the heart of Berlin working for a German factory. So I suppose something I never say in the book, but I hope is implicit, is that one of the amazing ironies of this is she survived, when the Germans weren't trying to kill her, the Allies were. because they were bombing the factory she was working in. And so she survived, the legendary Auschwitz. She survived another death camp called Ravensbrück, and Ravensbrück was a death camp. It was the only death camp on German territory. It also has the unique distinction of being the only women's camp. It was during the peak of its production, of its housing of women prisoners. It was the largest women's prison in the world, and they sent political prisoners there. They sent Jews there, like my mother, and it wasn't a death camp until the last several months of the war. They shut down the death works at Auschwitz, where my mother had been, and because the Russians were arriving and going to liberate the camp, and so they started up killing people in Ravensbrück, this camp my mother had been then sent to. So she seemed to, one time after another, and perhaps this is the only way anybody in my mother's position could have survived the war, one almost freakish, coincidental, act of, serendipity, whatever it might be, just one time after another, she just survived. Like last minute, Germans about to kill her, and they would need workers somewhere, so they'd pull her and some other women out of line and send them to work, and it was constant, one after another, where her life would be saved at the last possible second, just thanks to timing. And then she gets out of the camps in the latter part of the war, near its end, but not at its end, through just a miraculous, bizarre, and really sort of unheralded event that takes place in Germany that kind of gets her released from the last of her death camps.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that because that's what your book is basically about, how she was released and why, and actually how it even really led to Hitler's suicide. Why don't we go into all that? Because I think that's so fascinating. And like I said, I love history, and I always felt I knew a lot about World War II, but this is just opening a whole new thing that no one had any idea about. So why don't we really get into that?
Sure, I will tell you, it was my first history book, and I graduated with my degree in history from UCLA as an undergrad. So after all those years, I went back to my roots. So no matter what you get your degree in college, it may come back, maybe to haunt me in this case. I don't know, but it becomes of some use. I think I probably used it when I was a lawyer, because it taught me to kind of organize and get things chronological and figure out what the causes of things were. But yeah, this is my first history book, and it's been kindly received by the critics. But my mother had been working. She'd been saved literally. I mean this literally, from the gas chamber in Auschwitz. I don't mean that she would eventually been put in the gas chamber. I mean she was at the front of the line. I mean she was in line. This is documented not only by her, but there are testimonials by women that were sitting with her, and literally they had reached the front of the line, and there was the door right there. And one woman told an interviewer back in the early 1990s, who interviewed her about this, and her testimonials in a museum in Israel, in Jerusalem, she said, 2 minutes later, I wouldn't be here. And that's true. And they literally came off, and they cut the line off right in front of my mother, and they took a whole bunch of women to work at a factory in Berlin. And she worked for 9 months in a factory run by a guy named Krupp, who they're still a big Krupp corporation. It's now Tyson Krupp, but they were making armaments for the Germans. And they had a plant there in Berlin, and she gets sent off to there, and they're bombing the plant, and she's constantly running from the bombs. They don't let the Jewish women who are working at the plant hide in the bomb shelter. They make them, like, if they want to hide during the bombings, they dig ditches with their hands on the property of the factory, and they hide in the ditches. And nonetheless, they survive the bombing. She does. But at the end of the war, Krupp, who was a young man, by the way, as an early 20-something, he'd become very involved in the SS movement of the Nazi Party, and he become one of the founding members, if you will, of the SS and a supporter. So at the end, he decides, whoops, I got a lot of blood on my hands from all these slave laborers I'm using. So he gets rid of all the paperwork. He has it burned. He has it destroyed. And then the next step is he has to get rid of the evidence. So he orders the group of women that my mother is in at this slave labor camp. He orders them shipped to this extermination camp, excuse me, about 60 kilometers away in Germany. And she's supposed to be killed there, along with the other women. But while she's there, something really, really weird happens. I mean, even weirder than her being saved all those other times. She gets spared by the man who one could say was the most horrific murderer in Nazi Germany, and perhaps, therefore, maybe the most horrific murderer in history, because she ends up getting released by Heinrich Himmler. And for those who don't know who Heinrich Himmler was, he was the interior minister of Nazi Germany. He was Adolf Hitler's top advisor. He was the head of the Gestapo. When you hear people talk about the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler was the head of the Gestapo, and he was also the head of the SS. And to him, as the head of the SS, fell the duty, which I don't think he disapproved of in the slightest, to murder all the Jews in the world. I mean, that was his job as the head of the SS. That's what the SS did. They ran the camps. They ran the death camps. They ran, the murdering squads. They were the ultimate villains in history in many ways. Yeah. And how she gets released by him is basically the centerpiece of the book. If you want me to talk about it, I'll be happy to.
Oh yes,
Corey,
absolutely.
Well, you kind of have to go back to tell the story. Let me just at least tell this part of it. You got to go back to the very beginning of 1945. Now, the war ends in Europe. The Germans surrender in the early part, like the second week of May, roughly of May of that year. But in the early months of the war, in the early months of 1945, the war is still going on, and Himmler, of course, is this important figure, happens to have an aide, an assistant, who he is stationed in Stockholm, Sweden, and Stockholm, Sweden, is a neutral country during the war, although their neutrality during World War II sort of depended on what part of the war it was. I mean, they were a supplier of materials to the Nazis and sort of helped the Nazis in some indirect ways in the early middle part of the war, but when things started to look like the war was turning, they were not quite as helpful to the Germans. But they're a neutral country, and in this neutral country, he's placed this advisor. And also in the country, there live a number of Jews who have escaped Europe. Maybe not nearly as many as could have gotten in, but they weren't all allowed in as the war was beginning. But there are a number of Jews, and the number of Jews have lived there. And their grandparents live there. And there's an organization called the World Jewish Congress that's appointed a couple of Jews who are living in Sweden as their representatives of the World Jewish Congress in Sweden. And of all things, one Sunday afternoon at a tea party being thrown by a politician in Sweden, there's this advisor to Heinrich Himmler who's been invited, and there's also this guy who's this Jewish businessman, an industrialist, who's one of the representatives of the World Jewish Congress appointed by them, and they end up at the same party. Now, you would think they'd end up rolling on the ground trying to strangle each other to death, right. But instead, they are introduced, and they start talking, and after a few minutes of conversation, this Jewish industrialist, this very wealthy guy, realizes that this, German representative thinks he and the World Jewish Congress are like the most powerful organization in the world because he's a German during World War II. I mean, the Nazis completely believed, like it was their faith, like a religion, that the Jews ran everything. Even though less than 1% of the population of Germany, during the 1930s was Jewish, they believed the Jews ran everything in the world. So that as this German representative is talking to this Jewish business guy who's from Latvia, he's a recent immigrant, he thinks he's talking to a guy who's like runs the show. I mean, if you want Churchill to do something, you talk to the Jews and tell Churchill to do it. That's literally people think you're making this stuff up, but it's really their philosophy. And he decides that he's going to play on this. So he mentions that it would perhaps we've misunderstood your boss, Mr. Himmler, and perhaps it would be wise if representatives of the Jewish World Congress met with Mr. Himmler and talked to him about this, and perhaps we could arrange something. And by the way, if you're at all interested, I have in the past arranged passports under assumed names with citizenship to Latin American countries on the chance that you or someone else might want to go there after the war. And of course what he's playing to is the fact that as the war was approaching its end, it was pretty clear that the Allies were promising there would be war crimes trials. And so he snows this German into calling Himmler. And he calls Himmler up on a phone. He's got a private line and says, I got one of the Jews. I got one of the big Jews here. He's going to come. He's willing to meet with you. And Himmler goes, I don't know. I can't leave Germany. It might be a trap. If he comes here to Berlin, I will meet with him. So the guy goes back, tells this story that he's willing to. Himmler's willing to meet with this Jewish guy to talk about the war and the post-war world, but he's got to go to Germany. Well, for various reasons, this Jewish industrialist can't go. I won't go into detail, but amongst the details is he really doesn't speak German. His German's very bad. Speaks just a tiny bit of it. So literally, if I'm not boring you,
no, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? This is fascinating.
The Germans send a plane into Stockholm. And you got to understand, the German plane's got a big swastika on the side of it, right? They send a plane to pick up the Jewish representative in secret. Nobody can know about this. It's only going to be the Jews involved and Himmler and his people, because Himmler doesn't want anybody to know about this, especially Hitler, because he's going to be meeting with the Jews. Hitler would go bonkers. He might have Himmler shot if he learned this. So there they are. And only 2 hours before does everybody decide, basically, well, you can't go because you don't speak German and these various other reasons why you can't go. So they're standing there literally at the airport, and they turn, excuse me, they turn to this guy there, his first name is Norbert. Norbert was born in Germany. As a teenager, he came from Germany to work with his father. They started a fur business, and he's now 44 years old. So he's been living in Germany for 28 years or something, 26 years. Excuse me, in Sweden. And he's been living there, but he speaks fluent German. It's his native tongue. And they literally turn to him and say, Norbert, would you be willing to go? I mean, it's not been discussed before. I mean, Norbert's literally standing there at the airport expecting to wave goodbye to somebody else.
Wow.
And they say, you want to go? And he basically goes, okay. He's just, he's like a Jewish little businessman. He runs a fur business. He's the guy who, he makes fur coats. So he gets on this plane with literally minutes of notice. He just, okay, fine. Gets aboard the plane, flies to Berlin. And, the height of the bombing raids, Berlin's being bombed. lands Berlin. First thing that happens, he gets escorted off the plane. 6 uniformed SS officers are waiting for him. And they go, in unison, as if it was, choreographed. At one moment, their right hand rises, and they go, Sig Heil! Now, they're Sig Heiling a little Jewish businessman. And the eyewitnesses who were there, from which there was an account of this meeting, say that what happened next was he removed his hat, did the Swedish Jew, and looked back at the 6 SS and said, good evening.
Huh.
And he gets, okay, fine. He gets taken to meet Himmler, and there's a long segment of the book about how he gets there, and there's considerable issues involved in him eventually meeting with Himmler, but he does. Wow. And he meets with Himmler, and Himmler walks in, and literally they sit down across the table from each other, Himmler and the Jew from Sweden, as a little Jewish businessman, and of course Himmler's totally under the impression this guy, is one of the people who runs the world. And he says to him, in effect, what turns out to be, says Himmler, I'd like you to contact the Allied leaders like Churchill and Eisenhower for me, and tell them I'm willing to negotiate a ceasefire on the Western Front. Oh my God. And the Jewish businessman, he knows he has absolutely no ability to do this.
Right.
I mean, he's a furrier. And what he says is, in substance, oh yeah, sure, no problem.
Wow.
Oh yeah, of course, no problem. But if I'm going to do that for you, I'd like you to do a little something for me.
Right.
And he gets some concessions out of Himmler. He gets him to promise he'll stop the death marches, and he'll let the camps stay intact, so that the Allies can liberate them without executing any more Jews. Now, whether Himmler fulfills that or not is an open historical question. I mean, maybe he couldn't. Clearly, some of that goes on. Clearly, at that point in the war, some of that was stopping. But the other thing, I mean, this business guy, he's an avid chess player, and I think he understands at least how to play the game. And he goes, okay, that's fine. Now you've agreed to that, but I want something like now. 30 kilometers from here, where we're sitting, is this camp that I passed on the way here, Ravensbrück. You got Jews there, Jewish women. I know you're killing them. I want them released. I want a whole bunch of them released, and I want it now. Now you got to understand, this is a bluff.
Right.
This Jewish furrier is pulling off arguably the bluff of the century.
Yeah.
I mean, you watch James Bond movies, right? And there's James Bond sitting across from the head of Spectre, and he'll say something about bluffing. Basically bluffing something. You say, oh, we got this and we got that, or they know about this already when they don't, and it's a bluff.
Yeah.
Well, that's nothing compared to this bluff. First of all, that's fiction.
Right.
Second of all, James Bond is schooled in martial arts and knows how to shoot. This guy makes fur hats for a living.
Right.
This is what he does. And he's sitting in the heart of Nazi Germany, in a country where being a Jew is a capital offense, and he's sitting across the table and bluffing the head executioner, who could have him killed in a second.
Absolutely.
And that might be the best alternative in terms of what Himmler could do to him.
Yeah.
And Himmler agrees. And one of the women released is my mother.
Wow. My goodness. I mean, talk about a story. And why do you think that was never really brought to attention? Because I've never heard of that before in my life. Why do you believe that never really came out?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, it did come out, but very, very slightly. As I mentioned in the book, there are plenty of books about Himmler
Right.
and the war. In fact, there were 3 people present at the negotiations that night.
Wow.
3 Himmler advisors. There was really a fourth. The fourth was hung soon after the war. But the other 3 actually survived, even punishment. They survived. One got out of jail, for example, and all 3 of them wrote memoirs about their time with Himmler. And they published these memoirs. And each of the memoirs describes this meeting. So you've got these 3 German advisors to Himmler who were there, who write about this meeting with Norbert, this Jewish guy from Sweden, who had come in to meet with Himmler, and that, and they all have different takes on it, sort of like that old Japanese movie Rashomon, where every witness has a different take on what's going on, but they all agree he was there, and some historians have picked up on this and commented on it, but it's never like really more than like a page in a history book. It's just nobody really, in English at least, nobody really explores the story to the extent that it needed to be. It's just like, one of those interesting little things that happened in the midst of the war, and let's get on to the important stuff. And so I didn't learn about this till after my mother had passed away. I mean, I stumbled across it about 7 years after she had died, and when I happened to be, reading something about that period in the war and the camp my mother had been in, and I started, researching it. And it took me like 4 years of research to put together, all the material. It's sort of a piece at a time. So that's what this book is about. It's actually a pretty startling occurrence. And also I'll tell you one other reason why it didn't get perhaps as much play. In order to get the women out, they needed, I think, and wanted, but also needed the help of the Red Cross. So they contact the head of the Swedish Red Cross, who is a count, and literally a count, royalty. He's the nephew of the King of Sweden, is the head of the Swedish Red Cross, and he sends the buses. Very important figure here. He sends the buses to pick the women up. But when the war was over, this wonderful man, who obviously helped save lots of lives, unfortunately may take a little more credit for this particular incident than he literally deserved. Gotcha. Because only now, years later, I just read a book by a Swedish historian that came out, just a couple of months ago itself. They mentioned that this guy maybe took a little more credit than he deserved, and the net result was this incident of the release of these women from this death camp was always credited exclusively to this Swedish count, who wrote 3 books about his travails during the war, and he takes full credit of negotiating, their release, even though it was this guy from Sweden who comes in, this Fourier, who does it. So because this guy was so prestigious and did so many other things in his life, I think everybody just accepted the fact that he had been the one responsible for this, when in reality he was responsible for the transportation to get them out. But that's really where his part in this begins. Yeah. And the guy who actually risks his life flying into Germany to meet with Himmler sort of got very, very, like footnote status in books.
Wow, how interesting. And it makes sense. That's why they would just not really even think twice about it. But, I mean, I think that's incredible that you wrote this to really bring that to light, because, I mean, what a really amazing story that, I mean, and you even said it really kind of connected to Hitler's suicide and the downfall of him. I mean, so that is such a huge part of it, and hardly anyone really knew about it. But thank goodness you wrote this book to really bring it to light.
Well, people told me not to bother writing the book. You can't make history live. I've got a line that says, time passes, but it rarely flows. So when I finished doing the research on the book, I literally spent, I got a full-time job. I got a day job as a teacher, but a law professor. But I spent all the time for the next almost 4 years after I'd done the research just trying to do what I've hopefully done with this book, which is to make people forget it's a nonfiction. I mean, I tried to do for it what I would do for my writings for the New York Daily News. The New York Daily News, for those people who don't know it, is, it's a real newspaper, but it's kind of got a tabloid style.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote, and I wrote in that tabloid style when I was writing there. And this is not written, even though I got a mess of footnotes. You don't have to read the footnotes. Everything's documented, but it's not written like an academic book. I did not write it for that. I wrote it for a general audience, I thought, that would be interested in reading about this period of time, but wasn't particularly interested or likely to finish a book that was written like something a law professor might normally write. So I just spent, years just kind of trying to get it to read without changing any of the facts, like a novel. And I think I've done that. At least some of the reviewers, without my prodding, have said exactly that it flows like a fiction. But I have changed nothing. I just want people to understand that I've made up nothing in this book. A quarter of the book are endnotes, and everything is documented from memoirs, from memos, from histories written by other people about the period of time, and it's just kind of been pieced together the way lawyers do when they're writing, a legal brief. You take things written in all sorts of different cases by different judges, and you put them all in one to make one point, and that's kind of what this book tries to do.
No, absolutely. And I just want to say, too, you have 5 stars on Amazon and everything. People are loving this book, and it has incredible reviews. And, I mean, you can see why. I mean, what a phenomenal story, and the way that you did write it. I think because as much as history is great and it's awesome to learn about, it's difficult to read academic books for the average person. So for you to make it like a novel type of way and almost like a fiction way and make it more flow and interesting and exciting, I think that's a really great skill that you had that really separates it from so many other academic books. I think that's really phenomenal that you were able to do that.
Skill would be the ability to do that in the first couple of drafts. It was just elbow grease that after about 30 drafts of doing trying to get it to flow, that's when it got published.
I think you're too humble. I think you're way too humble. No, I think you're too humble. I give you a lot of credit because, I mean, people could draft that for years and years and years and years, and it still wouldn't be like that. So, I mean, really, I give you a lot of credit for that, and I think you should accept it. And I do want to talk about you and kind of your relationship with your mom as well, because, I mean, you don't even want to imagine, and you can't even imagine about how horrific it would be to be a Holocaust survivor and what your mother went through and almost dying tons of times and being this close to death, and then having a son and starting a family. What was your relationship with her like, and was she able to talk about it at all? How I'm sure it affected her whole life until the day she died. I mean, how was it? What was your relationship like with that, and was she able to speak about it or anything?
It took a lot of years after she passed away before I was really able to write about it. I didn't start the book intending to write about myself at all. As I say in the book, the last thing I expected was to find myself a character in it. But the more as I was finishing the history, it was suggested to me by a friend, and I realized it was correct that the war didn't just end with the peace treaty. The consequences of it, things like that continue on, as people who survived live, and
absolutely
they, in various ways, obviously and subtly, pass it on to their kids and to everybody they know, in a sense. And my mother and I had a very difficult relationship, and she was constantly convinced that I would be killed or die in some way. She was completely fearless for herself. She really was. I mean, my mother had been known amongst the women who had survived with her as like the toughest, which is really strange because my mother, if you met her, she was this delicate, very feminine, like 4'11", 90-pound woman.
Wow.
Just this very that's the way she spoke, that's the way she carried herself, that's the way she acted, that's the way she talked. But she had, during the war, like during bombing raids, like picked up other women and dragged them to safety. And I remember once she was older and she was very ill, and I was standing in her bedroom looking down at her. She was in bed, and she opened her eyes, and she said, she could see that I was concerned. And she said, Stanley, and by the way, she had this very thick Jewish accent. Stanley, don't worry. Hitler couldn't kill me. This won't. And she was right. She got well and lived several more years.
Wow.
So she was very, but she was a nervous wreck with respect to me. I don't want to make this more depressing than it may already sound, but she had lost 2 children in the war. The Nazis had taken, her first 2 children, and killed them.
Jeez.
And she was always convinced the same thing could happen to me. I mean, I'm not just talking about as a teenager. I mean, my 20s, my 30s, in my 40s. I'm a full-time law professor. I'm on TV all the time, and my mother's got to hear from me like every few hours, or she's convinced something has happened to me. Wow. It was a very difficult relationship. She was the most overprotective, mother you can imagine. I wasn't allowed to have a bike. I wasn't allowed to have skates. I wasn't allowed to learn to swim. She wanted me coming home right after school. If I was out on a date, she insisted I call so she would know I was okay. It was an oppressive, relationship, and maybe some of the listeners can identify with this. And if there's one personal story I want readers of a certain age to take out of this, is that I was always too afraid to really combat that, because I was too afraid of hurting her. I was too afraid that, the Germans had done so much to her already. I didn't want to add to her misery. And it wasn't until I basically was turning 40 that kind of the light kind of, like a cartoon, it kind of shone over my head, and I went, this woman's really tough. I'm not going to kill this woman if I don't call. No, I'm not going to kill this woman living in my own apartment. She survived Hitler. This isn't going to end. But it took me so long to do it that it is, because it took so long, it's very negatively affected my whole life. I never settled down. I never had a family. What girlfriend is going to settle down with a guy who has to call his mother every few hours? And I just want people to be aware of the fact that you can honor your parents. You can still be loved by them and not hurt them without necessarily having to, be always doing what they want. Sometimes they have very good advice, but sometimes it can be something where you just have to live your own life. If I'd learned that younger, I would have probably had a very different life.
Yeah, but I really, like I said, I couldn't even imagine going through that as she did, and what she had to survive. And of course it affected her whole life, and that in turn affected yours. And it's horrible, but at least you were able to eventually see the light with that. And I really think you're helping a lot of people with that too, because obviously she's not the only one that survived the Holocaust. There's thousands of them, thank God, and unfortunately tons that lost their lives. But for all the survivors and stuff that did start families, I'm sure a lot of them their families are kind of going through the same thing you did. So I think that kind of brings.
Well, I had a childhood friend contact me sort of out of the blue. She heard about my book and read it, and she was halfway through it when she sent me an email saying, "Look, this is Frida. How you doing? We haven't talked in a while. Look, I'm reading your book, and it's like my story. It's like you're writing about me. You're writing about and you're writing about me and all the other kids I knew growing up with parents who'd come out of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was its own thing, but there's lots of people out there whose parents suffered coming to America or in America, and had really horrific things happen to them in their youth, and it really does affect how they raise their kids. My mother my mother loved me perhaps too much, because always trying to be protective of me, but she lived her life sort of through me, which is not unusual. She wanted me to do, exactly what she was disappointed when I decided to become a lawyer. She thought it was too stressful. It might be hurtful. She wanted me to become something calm and quiet, like maybe a pharmacist. Work with chemicals. That's not something. She didn't realize you're risking your life working in a pharmacy. I mean, you might come in with a gun, but she was especially. I never told her when I was a public defender, and as I said, representing murderers for a living. I never really told her that I was representing some pretty scary people, so I didn't want her to worry. And then I was spending my evenings at the LA County Jail, talking to my gang clients who were in custody. So I mean, look, I didn't turn out too badly, but there are lessons to be learned from what I did wrong, and I think it's time I shared them.
No, absolutely. And like I said, I think so many people can learn from your story, and not even just with the personal side, but truly the historical side. I mean, so much, and I think that affected the war so much, and it really had a big effect on it. And this Jewish guy in the heart of Germany, making a deal with it, I mean, that's just unheard of, and it sounds fake, and that's really so cool that you were able to bring this story to life, and then also along the way help other families that their families been through such a horrifying, traumatic situation. So, I mean, what a really amazing thing you did with this book, and you should be very proud of it.
Well, I put all my legal writing to a side for several years. I haven't written any, real law review articles, which is sort of what I do, as a law professor. But it took a lot of years to do it. I mean, I hope it helps some people. I also hope it makes people aware of, hatred and the consequences of hatred. And
Yes.
and my attitude is, you read a book like this, and you realize this was going on. I mean, people always kind of alibi. I've noticed in some years recently, especially when I talk to them about what I'm writing, they alibi the other times this has occurred in history. It's like, they have some explanation. Oh, well, that was years ago and in a third world country, or you're talking about something that occurred in the 18th century. We've progressed far beyond that. This took place in the most sophisticated, advanced country in the world. It was Germany. I mean, people sent their kids to go to university in Germany because they had the best universities, the greatest scientists, the great writers and composers. This was the most advanced and sophisticated country in the world in the middle of the 20th century, which is, by the way, a blink ago. Exactly. in terms of history, the span of history. And if this could happen there, it can happen anywhere. And one of the reasons why I wanted to make certain that the book was completely accurate and true is that I wanted people to understand that we always have to be vigilant, that the beginnings of this don't become ignored, that we just don't toss them to a side and say, oh, it can't happen here. It can happen anywhere, any country, at any point in time. And I think there's something, I don't mean to be pessimistic, I think there's something in the DNA of human beings that is forever prepared through, long before antiquity to destroy the tribe next door, as the other. And I think it'll be a long, long time before this is removed from our DNA, if it ever is. And until then, we can't lay down and do nothing. You have to be just aware that these dangers exist.
Absolutely. And, I think that's a really good point to bring up. I think, especially when I was born, I don't know, when you think of World War II and stuff, I never knew anyone that was personally involved with it. So it seemed like it was such a long time ago, but it really wasn't. And it was very close to nowadays. And it was just a few years ago. I mean, it's terrible to think of. And you want to be like, oh my goodness, how could that possibly happen so close to today? But it did, and I think that's a good point. We need to really watch out for history because, unfortunately, we have seen many, many times history does repeat itself, and we need to be aware of that for sure. And I think that's a really good point to bring up.
Well, we have at least when it comes to the 30s and 40s, we have old movies, and I got to tell you, a lot of them are sappy, but there's a whole bunch of old movies that if you watch them, you realize, hey, people then were absolutely no different than we are today. They thought alike. Sometimes when clothes come back, they even dressed alike. The arguments about politics and religion were the same. They were identical to the way we are today. We're a little different, maybe in some countries. We're a little more progressive, or maybe a little more open. But that isn't in itself not enough. That's the trappings. There's something still underneath that we have to worry about. That really horrific things can happen, if we let it happen, and we always have to be aware of it, because that wasn't so long ago when people weren't all that much different than they are today.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and I think that's a very good point to bring up. And I really want to thank you for doing this. I mean, like I said, truly, you're such an amazing man, and you have this incredible career, and then this, insanely amazing, phenomenal book that really has opened so many eyes, and I really thank you so much for being on my show today. It was an honor having you.
And as you mentioned, it's on Amazon. And by the way, when I didn't have a cold, I did the audiobook, recorded books, bought the audio rights, and I had to audition to do the audiobook, but they let me do the audiobook, so there's an audiobook that can be bought on Amazon as well. And by the way, if you go to my website at my law school, LOS, that's Loyola Law School's initials, LOS.edu, Stanley Goldman, you can see a 30-minute interview I finally did with my mother in her later years when she was willing to talk about what happened in the war.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I would definitely have to check that out. And everyone, please go and buy the book as well, because, I mean, just amazing. And do you do anything else where people can keep up to date with you? Do you have social media or anything where people can see all that you're up to?
Well, theoretically, yes, but I haven't done a Twitter in a long time, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter, but I got to admit, with the book, I probably haven't been paying enough attention to it when I really should be, because I've been the book has only been out for about, I guess, almost exactly 2 months, and I've just been dealing with that.
No, absolutely. But in the short 2 months it has been out, I mean, such phenomenal response, and well deserved, because it's really amazing.
Well, thank you.
Yes. And thank you so much for being on the show. I really, really appreciate it. It was an honor.
Thank
I'd love to have you back.
I do appreciate it.
It was great talking to you.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye. Wow, what an incredible story. That man and what he's done, and his whole career, and his book, I mean, really just incredible. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please go watch that interview too with his mother. I mean, that sounds so, I'm gonna watch it immediately, I know. And because his mother is an amazing woman that has been through so much. And then and go buy the book and just support him, because he's doing some awesome things, and he's bringing a lot of things to light that I think the world really needs. So thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, never give up, always believe, and you'll achieve. Thank you, and God bless.